They tied him down like meat, iron bars beneath him, coals glowing red with a butcher's appetite. His flesh hissed, bubbled, peeled. Rome watched with the same cold eyes it had used to end so many lives before. But this time, something changed, because the man burning before them didn't scream. He didn't beg. He looked his killers in the eye and said, "Turn me over, I'm done on this side." It wasn't madness, it was mockery, and it echoed louder than any cry for mercy ever could. This is the story of St. Lawrence, the Roman deacon who turned torture into triumph and transformed the gridiron into his throne. A tale not just of flame, but of faith sharpened into defiance. Before the church crowned him a saint, before his name adorned cathedrals across Europe, he was just a man on fire. And somehow, that's where his legend began. Before fire kissed his skin and made him immortal, Lawrence walked the shadows of imperial Rome with quiet authority. He was no soldier, no senator, but in the underground world of the Christian faithful, he held a position of dangerous power, Archdeacon of Rome. The year was 2058 AD, and the city was a powder keg. The empire, once unstoppable, was fracturing. Barbarian invasions battered its borders. Plagues gnawed at its population, and the gods of old, Jupiter, Mars, Apollo, were no longer enough to bind the people together. A new faith was spreading, one without temples, without sacrifices, one that claimed all were equal, slave or emperor. Christianity. To Emperor Valerian, this wasn't just heresy, it was insurrection, and Lawrence, he was its treasurer. As Archdeacon, Lawrence managed the church's material wealth, but in early Christianity, wealth didn't mean golden idols or marble halls. It meant people, the sick, the poor, the widowed, the imprisoned. To the church, they were treasure. To the empire, they were threat. Lawrence knew his role was marked. When Pope Sixtus II, his spiritual superior, was dragged out mid-liturgy and executed in the catacombs, it was only a matter of time. But the death of his bishop didn't break Lawrence, it sharpened him. There's a legend, perhaps true, perhaps wholly exaggeration, that when Sixtus was led away, Lawrence cried out, "Father, where are you going without your son?" To which Sixtus replied, "Do not weep, my son. In 3 days you will follow me." 3 days. That's all the time he had left, and he used it not to flee, not to hide, but to prepare. Rome had demanded the treasures of the church, gold, jewels, artifacts. Lawrence promised to deliver them. And so, with calculated calm, he emptied the coffers. He sold sacred vessels, melted chalices, turned relics into coin. Then he gathered the true wealth, the lepers, the blind, the hungry, the forgotten. The empire expected golden idols. Instead, it got the poor. In a single act of defiance, Lawrence had redefined power, not with swords, not with sermons, but with the simplest, most subversive truth of all. You cannot kill what you do not understand. But Rome was about to try. Rome did not tolerate mockery, and it especially did not tolerate being made the fool by a lowly Christian deacon. When Lawrence appeared before the Roman prefect, an official whose name history has left in shadow, he did not arrive empty-handed. He entered not with fear, but with intention. Behind him shuffled a procession of human wreckage, the lame, the blind, the diseased, the abandoned. Each one bore the invisible scars of empire, starved by taxes, beaten by soldiers, forgotten by gods. Lawrence turned to the prefect and gestured with quiet finality. "Behold," he said, "the treasures of the church." There was no trembling in his voice, no apology, just an unshakable conviction that what stood before Rome was more precious than any crown jewel or sculpted deity. The prefect's face, as legend tells it, twisted from confusion to rage. He had expected gold currency to fund wars and silence senators. He had expected silver, something to melt, to sell, to own. Instead, he got beggars. And Lawrence had done something far more dangerous than hide treasure. He had redefined value in front of the very empire built on greed. To the Roman world, wealth was material, eternal in marble, sharp in sword, cold in coin. But Lawrence, he had pointed to the poor and declared them untouchable, sacred, divine. It was not just defiance, it was blasphemy against Roman order. This was no longer about punishing a religious dissenter. Lawrence had insulted the pride of empire, publicly, brazenly, and for that he would pay, not just with death, with spectacle. No simple beheading, no hidden execution. If Lawrence believed in divine fire, Rome would show him what its fire felt like. Hot, slow, merciless. The sentence was passed, the punishment chosen. The stage was set for one of the most infamous martyrdoms in Christian history. Rome was a master of death, not just in its application, but in its theater. Every execution was a message, every punishment a spectacle. But the sentence passed on Lawrence was unique, even by imperial standards. He was to be roasted alive, not on a pyre, not with torches, but slowly, intimately on a gridiron. A large iron grate was forged for the occasion, its bars wide enough to let flames breathe, but close enough to support a man. Beneath it, coals were stoked until they glowed a malevolent orange. Executioners prepared the device, like chefs preparing a feast, methodical, precise, and without haste. This wasn't just about death, it was about deconstruction. They stripped Lawrence of his robes, tied him down, wrists and ankles stretched tight, his back pressed to the iron. The heat began to rise. At first it would have felt like standing too close to an oven, intolerable, but not lethal. Then came the sear, the crackling of skin, the stench of human fat dripping onto hot metal. This was calculated. The fire was kept low and controlled, meant not to consume, but to cook. His nerve endings didn't burn away. They lived, screaming with every second. Eyewitnesses, if they existed, would have seen a man convulsing but conscious, face slick with sweat, lips moving in prayer or pain. The guards would have stood with arms crossed, watching him blister like meat. And yet, Lawrence didn't scream, didn't curse. He endured. Because this wasn't just execution, it was trial. A test of whether faith could survive flame. A battle between Roman cruelty and Christian resolve. But Rome had miscalculated. They thought pain would break him. Instead, it would become his punchline. Somewhere between agony and transcendence, St. Lawrence smiled. His body was breaking, nerve by nerve, layer by layer. Skin fused to metal, muscles clenched and tore. His chest rose in jagged gasps as the fire devoured him from below. Every second was a question of when, not if, his mind would collapse. But it didn't. Instead, it reached for something unthinkable, humor. Assumist, he said through cracked lips. Versa it manduca. This side is done. Turn me over and eat. The executioners froze. This wasn't a scream. It wasn't a plea. It was a joke, delivered by a man who was becoming ash. To the Romans, this was heresy of a different kind. They knew how to kill rebels. They understood blood and silence. But wit in the face of horror? That was something they couldn't scorch. Whether Lawrence truly spoke those words has been debated for centuries. Some say the line was a later invention by hagiographers. Others insist it was his final breath, recorded by horrified onlookers who could never forget it. But what matters is not whether the words were spoken, but why they endured. That joke shattered the moment. It pierced the Roman illusion of power. In one sentence, Lawrence became untouchable, not because he escaped death, but because he met it with a smile. He mocked the empire while it cooked him alive. The gridiron was supposed to erase him. Instead, it became his pulpit, his altar, his throne. That line, so grotesquely human and divinely defiant, would echo through Christian history. Artists painted it, preachers quoted it, saints envied it, because in that moment, faith triumphed over flesh. The prefect who condemned him would be forgotten. The soldiers who turned the coals would disappear into time. But Lawrence, he would become a legend told in fire and laughter. And Rome, for all its might, could never burn that away. When the fire finally claimed what was left of him, When skin had peeled, muscles gone rigid, and breath slipped into silence, Rome thought it had won. All it saw was a charred corpse on a bed of iron. But Christians saw something else, a crown forged in flame, a martyr not consumed by death, but consecrated by it. The body of Lawrence, or what remained of it, was gathered in secret. His followers risked everything to retrieve his remains from the execution ground, wrapping blackened flesh in cloth, weeping not for the pain, but for the power his death had released. He was buried in a simple tomb on the Via Tiburtina, and yet that tomb would become a beacon. Word of his defiance spread like wildfire. Across the empire, whispers turned to prayers. A man who had laughed through pain, who had fed the poor and defied emperors, was now being called something Rome never intended: holy. Within decades, that simple grave became a sanctuary. A basilica rose above it, San Lorenzo fuori le mura, one of the 7 great pilgrimage churches of Rome. And Lawrence was no longer just a martyr. He was a symbol, not just of suffering, of joyful suffering. A saint who didn't just endure death, but mocked it, who turned the tools of his torment into the instruments of his glory. The gridiron, once his torture rack, became his symbol, etched into stained glass, carved into cathedral doors, woven into priestly vestments. He became the patron saint of the poor because he gave them value in front of emperors. He became the patron saint of cooks because he died on a grill and turned it into a throne. And curiously, he became the patron saint of comedians because his final words were not a prayer, but a punchline. In Lawrence, the early church found its ideal martyr, not a man destroyed by Rome, but a man who beat Rome at its own game. He was burned to death, and yet somehow he never stopped shining. In the silence that followed Lawrence's execution, something shifted, not in the stones of the empire, but in the hearts of its people. Because what Rome had meant as a warning became a revelation. They had designed his death to strip him of dignity, to reduce his faith to ash, to remind Christians that the empire held dominion over body, over pain, over life itself. Instead, Lawrence's final act was not submission, it was sovereignty, and Rome felt it. The prefect who sentenced him is lost to time, forgotten, faceless, nameless. But Lawrence became immortal, not just in sainthood, but in memory. His name was whispered in catacombs, chiseled into stone, sung in hymns. Rome had tried to cauterize rebellion with fire, but they had created something far more dangerous, a man whose death was louder than his life. And that noise, it echoed. The very same year Lawrence was killed, Emperor Valerian, who had unleashed the crackdown on Christians, was captured by the Persians, not just defeated, but humiliated, forced to kneel as a human footstool before a foreign king. Later he died in captivity, flayed, stuffed, mounted like a trophy. To Christians, this wasn't coincidence. It was divine symmetry. Lawrence had been grilled alive. Valerian's pride was grilled in return. Some Roman officials began to question the methods. The executions didn't break the faith. They fed it. Martyrs like Lawrence weren't silencing the church. They were building it. And in the years that followed, Rome began to falter. Not from armies, not from famine, but from within. The persecution of Christians had shown not imperial might, but fear. Fear of an idea that could not burn. By the time Constantine legalized Christianity in the early 4th century, Lawrence's name was already legend. And as churches rose on the ruins of pagan temples, his story was carved into their very foundations. He was no longer just the deacon who defied death. He had become Rome's grilled conscience, a scar the empire could never cauterize, a reminder that the greatest powers can fall while the humblest servants rise in flame. St. Lawrence didn't die quietly. He didn't fade into history. He roared into it on a grate of iron, with flames under his back and laughter on his lips. His execution was meant to be a spectacle of fear. Instead, it became a sermon of defiance, not whispered from a pulpit, but shouted through fire. The man who roasted alive didn't just resist Rome, he humiliated it. And in doing so, he rewrote what it meant to be powerful. Not with wealth, not with weapons, but with a joke told at the edge of agony. So ask yourself, what kind of faith burns but doesn't break? What kind of spirit laughs while the body dies? And what kind of man can smile while becoming ash? St. Lawrence wasn't just a martyr. He was a mirror, showing us that even the weakest body can carry the strongest fire. If you think that death silences the truth, then you haven't heard the joke that echoed through an empire. Tell us what you think. Was Lawrence's legendary final line an act of divine courage, or the world's bravest joke? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more brutal, untold stories from the Roman world, where saints burn, emperors fall, and history is written in blood and flame, subscribe to Legion Chronicles. Because in this empire, even ashes speak.